So our practice is research-based and it's community-based, and it focuses on LGBTQ IA+ histories from around the country. Our life's work is a series of ongoing installations based on really old, little-known queer histories from each state, which we call a 50 States project. And then out of that project come many ancillary works, all of which are in the show at the Blaffer right now.
The scene, which is the large piece that is framed like a map of the inner loop with the freeways with portraits of drag queens, is actually an outgrowth of our 50 States Texas project. In working on 50 States Texas, which actually dealt with a 1895 lesbian novel out of LaGrange, Texas, we ended up coming across all of these amazing stories of the drag scene in Houston in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, sort of leading up to the beginning of the AIDS crisis. And so we ended up making a whole body of work that dealt with the drag scene in Houston during those years, and specifically its sort of political impact and cultural importance, both within the region and nationally. And so the scene, which is the 8-part map that's upstairs at the Blaffer, is kind of the central work to that collection of pieces.
The cut maps are initially actually inspired by seeing an exhibit that was ethically very problematic, but the Bodies exhibit when it was in New York, which had a room of the human vascular and pulmonary system excised from the rest of the human body, and seeing that exquisitely beautiful network of what felt like roads and waterways that go through the body that carry everything that keeps us alive, felt like this totally gorgeous way of looking also at landscape and looking at maps and looking at these old road maps, which Nick and I, like I think many people, think old road maps are really beautiful, but starting to realize that if we could take away all of the land that was connecting these roads and waterways, that we would wind up with this arterial network that felt like the human body inside of the landscape. And then after several years of experimenting with this idea, we realized that if we could start laying over imagery that was really important to our identities as queer Americans and the queer communities that we get to know in our practice, that we could really assert that these images and this history has a corporeal, deep, deep, deep connection to the places that they're from. And so in excising these images out of in the case of the scene, the Houston maps and the Texas maps there, what we were trying to say is that these queens, these performers, have as deep of a connection to what this landscape is as any kind of like organ way of looking at things, any kind of body way of looking at things. Another piece that's up there is the Pageant Crown cut map. And that piece is based on an image of a pageant crown from the Gulf Coast Archive and Museum of Gay and Lesbian History, and which is an archive here in Houston. And we took that pageant crown and we cut it into the map of Texas, and then we backed it with video that Nick and I shot over at the oil refineries east of town of one of the flares coming out of one of the tall stacks. And it's an incredibly zoomed in shot of that flare. And what we were trying to get at with this is just the astonishing power that these drag queens had in the community here. And it's not just the power of performance, the power of making people feel, the power of building community, but it is literally, these drag queens raised so much money during the AIDS crisis, continue to raise so much money for the community. They are actually the force behind making a community visible, of being the folks who are at the parades, who are at the marches, who are at the literal forefront of this movement. And it's a community that Nick and I feel gets short shrift in looking at queer histories and looking at political movements. And so we wanted to make these works that really held that.
Sitting in one pandemic and thinking of another is an extension of a series of what we've called spray pieces over the course of, I guess we've been doing from the last 8 or 9 years. in which we have taken various evocative color palettes related to our identity as a same-sex married couple or family histories or queer identity, and sprayed each other with them, usually over the course of an hour, sort of marking each other, again, much like the maps, kind of connecting these histories and memories with the body and sort of viscerally attaching them to our identity. And we had done this piece, or a version of this piece, for Countercurrent several years ago. And when Countercurrent went virtual this year and they asked us to sort of reprise it, we ended up shifting it in light of the pandemic.
One of the things that happened when we started to think about how we would make this piece again right now was that we realized that there's certain things that are technically necessary in making these spray pieces. And one of them is wearing an N95 mask so that the off spray from the paint doesn't get into our lungs. And suddenly we realized how much weight this piece of equipment that was now considered personal protective equipment that everybody needed, that was an incredibly short supply at that time, that we had an open bag of in our studio that we tried to donate and we couldn't donate because it had been opened. And we realized that this thing that we used as an occupational hazard protective equipment had become this thing that was going to keep an entire society safe during this pandemic. And it started to make us really think about the ways that this piece, making a piece right now that dealt with contagion, feels so relevant and connected to the AIDS epidemic, which shaped everything about the way that Nick and I, as gay men in our late 30s, early 40s, view ourselves. It's what we grew up during. It has shaped kind of our entire practice. It's shaped our entire way of being. And so thinking, and we put it in the title, that we don't really have a thesis particularly about how these two pandemics connect. There's no neat thing. There's certainly disparate effects of different populations that are parallel. You have people of color being disproportionately affected by these pandemics. You have people without easy access to healthcare being disproportionately affected. All of these things that play out again and again, really anytime that we have a national catastrophe, are playing out here. But what we wanted to say in making this piece was that we are immersed in this connection. We are thinking about it. We are, it is surrounding us, and it's enveloping us.
And I think as grim as it is in some ways to be looking at these two pandemics and just contemplating death and contagion, and the hot pink, which I think most people probably know is a sort of marker of gay identity, is also a really bright, celebratory, intense color. And the idea that there's also a lot of cultural value that came out of reactions to the pandemic and came out of organization around the AIDS crisis. And that, like, there's a lot of vibrant, amazing things in the community and in our identity that are a direct result of the organizing and fight against the AIDS virus, the HIV virus.
And so maybe there's some hope that a similar organizing and social change can come out of this pandemic. Our work is often presented in immersive installations that take over an entire space and have lots of tangential works within them. So we'll have a central video installation and then cut maps around and all sorts of things, and then a performance lecture that comes with it. And it's a very holistic world. And one of the great joys of being part of this show was walking in after it had opened and seeing individual pieces from our life's work in conversation with all of these other pieces, many of whom are, our favorite artists in Houston, who we look up to, who we are so proud to call colleagues. And to see our work in that context has actually gotten me thinking quite a bit about how much the body plays through all of our work. These are pieces where it's more overt and it's more, I can really tie a thing between, seeing a thing of the anatomy of the human body, and so we cut these maps, or in spraying paint all over our bodies, it's very evident in it. But I'm also realizing how much the way that we think of body, the way that we think of decay within the body, and the way that we think of all of the history, all of the emotional weight, in addition to the viruses and the things like that that we carry, plays through not only all of our work, but I think in many ways how we think of queer history generally. And it's been, as we're thinking about our future projects, we're right now working on projects in Utah and Louisiana. It's a really wonderful lens to be able to look at that through as well. And so we've really enjoyed being part of that